The man known to history as Alan Matheson Turing was born on the 23rd of June 1912 at Warrington Lodge, on Warrington Avenue in Maida Vale, a residential district of London in England near the seat of government power at Westminster. His father was Julius Matheson Turing, the son of a clergyman and an employee of the Indian Civil Service, at a time when Britain still ruled the subcontinent of India, which had been conquered in the course of the 18th and early 19th centuries. The family's unusual surname derived from the mix of their English, Dutch, and Scottish heritage. His mother was Ethel Sarah Stoney. She was born to a family which also had connections to the British Raj in southern Asia, Ethel's father having been chief engineer for the Madras Railways in southeastern India. The Stoney family also had a scientific background. Ethel's ancestor was George Johnston Stoney, an Irish physicist who is best known for introducing, in 1891, the term electron as the basic unit through which to measure electricity. Turing's childhood was shaped substantially by his parents' work in India as they travelled between England and the Raj. Alan and his older brother John spent most of their younger years in boarding schools or living in various residences. One which was notable was that of a retired British Army couple at St Leonards-on-Sea near Hastings, while summers were spent at the family home at Guildford in Surrey. It was whilst attending Hazelhurst Preparatory School in Sussex from 1922 to 1926 that the young Alan began to demonstrate an interest in science, particularly chemistry. A letter dated 1925 to his mother expresses a concern he had to develop scientific approaches which would be as efficient as possible. His precociousness was recognised early on, and he was sent to the Sherborne School in Dorset after Hazelhurst, although there were concerns raised about his field of interest, as British educational establishments then held the view that an interest in the Greek and Roman classics or literature was the more fitting preserve of an English gentleman. By his early teenage years, Turing showed a level of understanding of modern scientific theories, such as Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, which would have been expected in a university undergraduate student. It was also at Sherborne that Turing entered his first significant relationship with a fellow pupil, Christopher Colin Markham, although it was brutally cut short in the early spring of 1930 when Markham died from bovine tuberculosis. Later, Turing's sexual preferences would have a considerable impact on the course of his life, but for now this early tragedy seems to have led him to pour greater energies into his studies as a distraction from the pain of Markham's death. It is also possible, although by no means definite, that Markham's death may have led Turing to abandon any particular attachment to religious beliefs that he might have had, and adopt an atheistic stance. His depth of feelings for Markham are reflected by the fact that he maintained a correspondence with Christopher's mother for many years after his death. It is also to this period that the beginning of Turing's sustained engagement with the field of quantum mechanics can largely be traced. Much of this may have been informed by Alan's early reading of the work of John von Neumann, a brilliant young Hungarian mathematician, physicist, and computer scientist, who would later go on to play a significant role in the Manhattan Project in the United States, the US government project to develop an atomic weapon during the Second World War. Armed with this newfound dedication to the field of quantum mechanics, Turing entered King's College, Cambridge in 1931. Turing arrived at Cambridge as the world around him was changing, in ways which would have profound implications for him years ahead. Late in 1929, after years of economic growth known as the Roaring Twenties, the US stock market had crashed spectacularly. The Wall Street crash, as it became known, was followed by years of economic depression, the Great Depression. Some countries were more severely affected than others, but one of those which was hit the most was Germany, a country which had already been rocked by internal turmoil in the early 20th century, owing to its defeat in the First World War, and by 1932, the life savings of many Germans had been totally obliterated, and the unemployment rate had skyrocketed to nearly 30%. As a consequence, a number of extremist parties saw their support grow considerably in the years between 1929 and 1932, notably the Communist Party of Germany, but none more so than the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party. By exploiting disaffection with the economic situation in Germany and resentment over the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had been concluded in the aftermath of the end of the First World War in 1918, the Nazis were able to become the largest party in the German parliament, the Reichstag, in the summer of 1932. This did not bode well for the maintenance of peace in Europe. Thus, as Turing was acquiring his advanced education at King's College, Cambridge, in the early 1930s, events were unfolding on the continent which would have major consequences for his life in the years to come. Significantly, it was during his early years at Cambridge that Turing became familiar with Principia Mathematica, a 3-volume work on the foundations of mathematics, which had been co-produced by mathematicians and philosophers Alfred North Whitehead and Bertrand Russell. Through this, Turing began to query issues of mathematical logic and how to express mathematical propositions in symbolic logic using the most convenient and intelligible notation. Meanwhile, his personal life became more stable at King's, a welcome change for an individual who had suffered through such a tumultuous upbringing in several different homes and schools. He engaged in rowing, running, and sailing. He became more comfortable in his homosexuality and developed a relationship with a fellow mathematician, James Atkins. He also, in 1933, joined the anti-war movement at Cambridge. In the spring of that year, the Nazis had tightened their grip on power in Germany through the passage of an Enabling Act, which allowed Hitler and his senior ministers to rule by decree. All of this once again raised the spectre of major conflict in Europe. However, Turing was no pacifist, and while his politics were slightly of the left, these views did not lean towards the Marxism which was increasingly favoured in some intellectual circles in Britain. In 1934, Turing completed his undergraduate degree at Cambridge in mathematics. A year later, he was elected as a Fellow of King's College at the markedly young age of 22. Then, in 1936, came the first major disseminated output. That year, he published a paper entitled On Computable Numbers with an Application to the Entscheidungsproblem in the Proceedings of the London Mathematical Society. The Entscheidungsproblem, or decision problem, was a concept which had been developed by the German mathematicians David Hilbert and Wilhelm Ackermann in 1928, in which it was theorized whether an algorithm could be developed which could answer an infinite series of yes or no answer questions with a universal degree of accuracy. Turing's solution was the basis for what has now become known as the Universal Turing Machine. The Universal Turing Machine was effectively the precursor of what has become the modern Central Processing Unit, or CPU, of a modern computer. In 1936, it was an abstract computational device intended to help determine the extent and limitations of what can or cannot be computed in line with solving the decision problem. Turing described his theoretical machine at the time as an automatic machine, and it was conceived by him as a device which could compute real numbers. Months later, though, the concept would acquire the name Turing Machine, when Alonzo Church, an American mathematician, referred to the concept in this way in a review of Allen's work of 1936. The Universal Turing Machine would become an idea with major practical importance. Such a machine, if created in reality, would have a complex set of algorithms built into it, which would be capable of interpreting and responding to any data which was given to it. In this way, it can be thought of as a blueprint for a computer program, and the mechanical tasks which the Universal Turing Machine might carry out would be in response to how these algorithms interpret the data fed into the machine. This was the basis for creating a single machine which could, in theory, be utilized to accomplish a wide array of tasks, depending on how it was programmed. For instance, playing a chess simulation 1 minute and later typing text. While no such machine or computer existed in 1936 through which Turing's theory could be tested in a practical manner, the idea he outlined was effectively the basis for the elementary computer programs, which would first begin to be developed 10 years later. Around the same time that he published his work late in 1936, Turing headed for the United States, where he took up a position undertaking research under the tutelage of Alonzo Church at Princeton University in New Jersey, the man who would christen the Turing Machine a few months later. Eventually, Allen would acquire his PhD from Princeton in 1938 for a thesis entitled Systems of Logic Based on Ordinals. He also published extensively at this time. This output included new theorems in algebra and number theory. Already his abilities as a polymath able to grapple with many different disciplines and fields of inquiry, were in evidence. And during the course of his lifetime, Turing would eventually work and publish in the areas of mathematics, physics, biology, artificial intelligence, behavioral science, and computing, to name just the most prominent ones. Perhaps more significantly, at the time, he had begun studying cryptography whilst at Princeton, the art of sending coded communications or ciphers and deciphering them. Cryptography had its origins in ancient times, and early modern and modern governments had long used ciphers and codes to disguise their communications in case they should be intercepted by enemy states. However, with the advent of modern electronic machines, the development of ciphers and cryptographic messages had been revolutionized. Turing now entered into this field. He even found time to develop an electromagnetic cipher machine during this American sojourn, a practical application of his work in theoretical mathematics. It is plausible that Turing was taking a greater interest in cryptography at this time, in anticipation of Britain being drawn into a major European conflict following the rise to power of the Nazi Party and their leader, Adolf Hitler. In 1933, the state of affairs in Europe had gradually devolved. First, the Nazis began rebuilding their military and air force. Then, in March 1936, they remilitarized the Rhineland region of Western Germany, a clear breach of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. 2 years later, in March 1938, a more aggressive action was taken when Germany effectively annexed Austria into Greater Germany, and the Nazis began applying international pressure to have a large portion of Czechoslovakia, called the Sudetenland, annexed to the German state the following autumn. These actions between 1936 and 1938, while Turing was at Princeton, in retrospect make it seem inevitable that a conflict was imminent in Europe, and of this, there can have been no doubt after the Nazis effectively completed the conquest of Central Europe in the spring of 1939 without ever firing a shot, when various parts of Czechoslovakia and Hungary were formed into puppet regimes or annexed. And just months later, when the forces of the German Third Reich poured over the border to invade Poland on the 1st of September 1939. The conflict, which had seemed inevitable for months, finally broke out. On the 3rd of September, Britain and France declared war on Germany, signaling the beginning of what would soon become a Second World War. Perhaps Turing's return to Britain was in anticipation of the outbreak of this conflict. He had turned down a temporary teaching and research position he had been offered at Princeton in 1938 after he had completed his doctoral research. Also, he had not been back in Britain for very long before he was working on a secret basis for the cryptanalytic department of the British government. The goal of Turing's work for the British government in the pre-war period of early 1939 was to decipher the mechanical Enigma code, which was being extensively used by the Nazis to send coded signals within the German armed forces, Air Force, and Navy. The Enigma Machine had been developed at the end of the First World War, but it had only been utilized regularly by the German state from the mid-1920s onwards, and it was an extremely secure means of communication which foreign governments would not crack for years to come. The Enigma machine itself appeared much like a typewriter, with letter keys in a pad of sorts. It used an electromagnetic rotor mechanism to scramble the letters of the alphabet as they were fed into it. This legible text became ciphertext, which could only be unscrambled by someone who had the machine settings in their possession. With these settings, the ciphertext which an individual received, for instance in Berlin, could then be unscrambled back into the intelligible text which had originally been put into an Enigma machine somewhere else, like Munich or Cologne. These machine settings were generally changed on a daily basis by the Nazi military command, and so it was necessary to find a way to decrypt the machine in order to intercept German military communications. As Turing's work on mathematics and cryptography was now well known to the British government, he was brought in to help in this task, following his return to his homeland from the United States. Following the eventual outbreak of the war in September 1939, Turing's secret work on this project became more transparent. He was quickly transferred to the Government Code and Cipher School, a branch of GCHQ, Government Communications Headquarters, and for the duration of the war, the school's work would be carried out at Bletchley Park, an English country house which had been built in the 1870s near Milton Keynes in Buckinghamshire. It was from here that Turing would conduct his most celebrated work over the course of the next 6 years, working from what was termed Hut 8. Turing was there by the 4th of September 1939, the day after Britain declared war on Germany. The team at Bletchley were quickly handed an enormous advantage in their efforts. In October 1938, the Polish cryptologist Marian Rejewski, having worked on the Enigma for much of the 1930s, had developed a special-purpose machine to decipher the German Enigma codes. This cryptologic bomb, or bomb as he termed it, was developed using information which the Polish government had obtained that the first 3 letters in the Enigma code were always the same as the second set of 3 letters. Using this information, Rejewski was able to develop a machine, or bomb, to technically check the code at high speeds and decipher messages being sent by the Germans using the Enigma. Using this method, the Poles were able, by the end of 1938, to reconstruct the keys which were changed daily by the German authorities in a period of about 2 hours. In July 1939, the Poles, wary of the imminent war and Hitler's designs on their country, decided to share their information and technology with Britain and France. This information, and the bomb, provided an enormous advantage to Turing and his colleagues at Bletchley Park as they set about their work there in the opening months of the war. This is not to diminish the significance of what was achieved at Bletchley Park in the years that followed. By late 1940, the team here, largely based on Turing's input, but also substantial contributions from a fellow Cambridge mathematician, William Gordon Welchman, succeeded in devising a much more effective version of the Polish bomb. What has become known as the Turing-Welchman bomb made the reading of intercepted messages sent between branches and units of the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, a routine procedure by the end of 1940. This was of considerable significance, and following the quick conquest of Poland in the autumn of 1939, the Germans had turned their attentions north and west in 1940. Norway and Denmark were soon brought under German hegemony. Then in May, the German armed forces barreled through the Low Countries and northern France, winning the war on the Western Front in a matter of weeks. The British expeditionary force on the continent was only salvaged through a daring maritime operation to evacuate over 300,000 Allied troops from the northern French port of Dunkirk. With that, the war switched to German aerial bombings of England, and London in particular. The Blitz, as it has become known, continued intensively for months into 1941. Consequently, the development of the bomb, which allowed for easy deciphering of the German Air Force's messages in late 1940, was a coup for the team at Bletchley. While bombings could not be prevented, henceforth, some advanced warning of them could be given. Interception of naval messages was a more difficult matter. Communications between the German submarines and other marine commands in the North Atlantic utilized a more complex version of the Enigma. Turing set himself the task of cracking it himself at Bletchley, later claiming that he had been allowed to undertake the task almost exclusively himself as no one else wanted to go near the challenge. Such was its complexity. He solved it within 3 months. By the start of December 1939, Turing had a working crack, a cryptanalytic process called Biography after a method developed by the Polish cryptographers, but elaborated on by Turing. However, even then, it was not possible to put this into practice without further details on how the Enigma was used by the German Navy, as well as some base codes to allow Turing's crack to be effectively utilized. This was accomplished in 1941. On the 9th of May that year, crew members of the HMS Bulldog, a British Royal Navy destroyer-class ship, boarded the German submarine U-110 and recovered the ship's cryptographic materials, including the current Enigma keys. Using these, the team at Bletchley was able to now put Turing's crack into operation. Henceforth, British intelligence was able to intercept German naval communications with relative ease. The significance of this most recent breakthrough cannot be underestimated. From the outset of the war, the British had been fighting an extensive naval conflict with the Germans in the North Atlantic, the Nazis having developed a formidable fleet of submarines called U-boats to strike secretly at British shipping. As a small island country, Britain was highly dependent on imported goods, both to feed its people and, more significantly, to bring in the many kinds of war material which it required to continue the struggle against Hitler's Germany. Keeping these routeways open was especially critical in 1941, as Britain found itself alone against Germany in Western Europe, and the United States had not yet entered the war on the side of its former ally from the First World War. The Battle of the Atlantic was proving an enormous sap on British supply lines up until 1941. The German submarines generally destroyed about 5 British merchant ships for every submarine that was lost. As an operation, the battle involved thousands of ships, and was the most complex naval operation ever to occur, involving over 100 ship convoy battles, and perhaps over 1,000 one-on-one engagements between British ships and German U-boats. Now, with the Enigma code being used by the German U-boats in the North Atlantic rendered at least temporarily defunct, the British were able to chart the patrol routes of German submarines and predict which convoys of British ships they intended to attack. As a result, in the months that followed from the summer of 1941, the number of British ships being lost in the North Atlantic to German submarine attacks declined by nearly 70%. This would not have been possible without Turing's work. There is no doubt that he was responsible for this enormous tactical advantage which the British Navy now enjoyed. However, the tactical advantage gained was temporarily lost in the spring of 1942 when the Enigma code being used by the German Navy was changed substantially. The German Admiralty having realized that the British were now easily deciphering their communiques. But by 1942, the German war effort was faltering more broadly. A decision to leave Britain unconquered and turn to the east against Soviet Russia in mid-1941 was, in retrospect, the death knell of Nazi Germany. Though initially successful, by the winter of 1941, the German armed forces were stopped before they seized the key Russian cities of Moscow and Leningrad. The winter saw tens of thousands of Germans either die or become incapacitated as a result of the onset of the Russian winter and the lack of suitable winter clothing to combat the cold amongst the German rank and file. Thus, when the Enigma code was changed early in 1942, the war effort had turned in Russia's favor on the Eastern Front, and when the Germans were defeated in a lengthy siege of the city of Stalingrad the following winter, the Russians would begin pushing them back out of Russia, and they would not stop moving west until they reached Berlin in 1945. All that lay in the future, though, for the cryptographers at Bletchley Park in the early 1940s. In the middle years of the war, Turing's reputation within Hut 8 and the headquarters there had become prodigious. One of the cryptographers who worked there with him, Peter Hilton, a not insignificant mathematician in his own right, would later conclude that working with Turing was the experience of working with an authentic genius. Yet there was also a quirky side to him. During the summer months, Turing would often wear a gas mask whilst cycling to and from the office to prevent his hay fever from acting up. A talented long-distance runner, he would subsequently try out for Britain's Olympic marathon team in 1948, and when he was called to meetings in London during the war period, he would often run the 40-kilometre trip to the capital. Enigma and the cracking of it were not Turing's sole concern at Bletchley Park during the war years. For instance, he developed a procedure which was named Turingary, named after him, which could be used to decipher encrypted messages sent using another German cryptographic machine called the Turing cipher machine. Additionally, in the closing stages of the war, he developed a portable secure voice scrambler which was codenamed Delilah. Hence, in addition to breaking the various German codes, Turing was overseeing the development of systems whereby the British and their allies could communicate more securely and secretly themselves, without the Germans, Japanese and Italians intercepting their military messages. It is perhaps unsurprising to find Turing being promoted as a result of this work. In November 1942, he was seconded to the United States, the country having entered the war on Britain's side after an unprovoked attack on their Pacific Fleet stationed in Hawaii by Germany's ally, the Empire of Japan, in December 1941. During a 4-month sojourn in America, Turing imparted much of his knowledge on the Enigma and various other cryptographic matters to the American Secret Services. When he arrived, he was decidedly unimpressed with the Americans' own code-breaking systems. Back in Britain from March 1943, Turing was increasingly focused on the electronic machines which were being devised at Bletchley and elsewhere to decipher the Enigma and other German codes in ever quicker times. His mind was seemingly increasingly pondering how these new machines might be employed to develop an electronic, real-life version of the universal Turing machine, which he had theorized and written about in 1936. During the war, Turing also considered adopting what was, by the standards of the time, deemed a more socially acceptable domestic situation. Whilst working at Bletchley, he had, in 1941, proposed to one of his colleagues, Joan Clark. She accepted, and he was introduced to her family, though she later stated that she had suspected Turing's homosexuality from quite early on in their acquaintance. When he eventually reconsidered and confessed to her his actual sexual preferences, she was unfazed. They called off the marriage but remained lifelong friends. By 1944, as the war was entering its final stages, Turing was setting out on a new endeavour to develop a universal machine such as he had conceptualized in the mid-1930s. This would be a machine capable of performing multiple functions within one physical unit. It is important to remember that by the standards of early computing, this machine would not resemble a modern computer in any fashion. It would have been an enormous unit, perhaps the size of several wardrobes pushed together. Turing's conceptual idea was that such a machine should be able to begin acquiring many of the faculties of a human brain, where previously he had been hamstrung by having ideas which could not be put into practical application. The technological developments which had occurred as a result of the war had opened up the possibility of what could be achieved by such a universal machine. His writings from the mid-1940s suggest an individual increasingly preoccupied with how a universal machine could be constructed, which would embody intelligence in an artificial form. But he was not alone. In 1945, a paper appeared in the United States written by John von Neumann, the Hungarian-born mathematician whose writings had first stimulated Turing's interest in the field of quantum mechanics in the late 1920s and early 1930s. The first draft of a report on the EDVAC, as it is known, was a 101-page document which outlined a logical design for a machine called an Electronic Discrete Variable Automatic Computer, or EDVAC for short, that would be able to make computations using an inbuilt or stored program. What has become known as the von Neumann architecture, after the paper he wrote, was effectively the first published description of how a modern computer system would operate. Not to be outdone, Turing now took up a position with the National Physical Laboratory in London, where he was charged with developing and designing a similar computer system, with a view to actually producing one. The result in late 1945 was a report on what was termed the Automatic Computing Engine, or ACE for short. The ACE was not simply a reiteration of the EDVAC computer von Neumann had theorized in America. Turing's particular contribution was in the use of abbreviated computer instructions, an early form of programming language or code. Thus, Turing's concern was with the algorithmic codes which would program the machine, much as he had been concerned with algorithms when he theorized the universal Turing machine in 1936. The specifics of constructing the ACE seem at once underwhelming and bizarre by today's standards. Turing estimated it would cost £11,200 to build, roughly about £160,000 in today's money, adjusting for inflation. The high-speed memory would be just 25 kilobytes, or 0.025 of a megabyte, which could be accessed at a speed of 1 megahertz. Thus, the specifications for this computer were several thousand times smaller than those which one would find on a mid-range laptop, which could be purchased for £600 or £700 today. Yet what was being conceived was something wholly novel, a self-contained machine which could be programmed to carry out several different processes. Turing imagined that the ACE would be able to switch from undertaking mathematical work and code breaking to more rudimentary file handling or the ability to play a game of chess. He also theorized that, in time, such machines could be developed to begin learning from the programming that was put into them. With the report for the ACE produced, Turing might have looked forward to seeing it built, but he was to be disappointed. Infighting at the National Physical Laboratory and a personality clash with his supervisor there, John Wormersley, ensured that progress on it was slow. Eventually, it would not become operational until the 10th of May 1950, when its first program was run. At that time, it was the fastest computer in the world. Moreover, a number of further computers built during the 1950s, notably the English Electric Deuce and the American Bendix G15, owe much of their design to the ACE, which Turing plotted and conceived of. In the meantime, Turing had moved on. In 1946, he had been made a member of the Order of the British Empire in reward for his wartime service at Bletchley Park. Now in the autumn of 1947, he left the National Physical Laboratory in order to return to Cambridge. Here he undertook some work in neurology and physiology and wrote on the concept of neural nets, specifically his emerging idea that a machine could develop the ability to learn. However, much of this work would remain unpublished in his lifetime, and Turing's contribution in this area has only been recognized posthumously. In 1948, The hero of Bletchley Park was appointed as a reader in the mathematics department at the University of Manchester. This was just around the time that the Manchester Mark I was demonstrated in the northern city in June 1948, developed at the University of Manchester. It was one of the first examples of a stored program computer of the kind which Turing was the architect of. Its demonstration at Manchester around the time Turing arrived there to take up his position was fitting, as he had written the program manual for the Manchester Mark. In his first years at Manchester, he was further co-opted to carry out work on successors to the Manchester Mark and to develop software for these machines. He was also appointed as Deputy Director of the Computing Machine Laboratory. Nevertheless, his interests were beginning to shift elsewhere, returning to more abstract and theoretical mathematics after this intense period of practical application. In particular, he was increasingly preoccupied with the concept of artificial intelligence. Accordingly, in 1950, Turing developed what has become known as the Imitation Game, or the Turing Test. This was a test of a machine's ability to exhibit intelligent behavior, similar to that of a human being, or to imitate the cognitive abilities of a human being. The test involved a scenario whereby a human evaluator would engage in two conversations through a textual format. The catch being that one conversation was being had with another human being who the evaluator could not see, whilst the second was a conversation that was occurring with an unseen computer that was responding to the human evaluator and producing textual responses designed to seem like those of a human. The test was to see if the evaluator could discern if the computer output seemed human or not. Turing published the idea in a paper of 1950 entitled Computing Machinery and Intelligence. The Turing Test has, in the intervening 70 years since it was first devised, become a significant concept in the field of artificial intelligence and the philosophy of machine intelligence. It also has modern applications. A reverse version of it is used widely today as the basis of the CAPTCHA test, which is in widespread use online to ensure that users of an internet site are indeed human and not computers. It was also at Manchester that Turing developed what might be deemed the first computerized chess program. Shortly after his arrival in the north of England in 1948, he and an undergraduate, David Gowan Champernowne, began developing a program. By 1950, they had devised the program for TurboChamp, an elementary program which could potentially play a low-skilled game of chess, independent of human input, by computing possible moves. It could, however, not be put into execution in the 1950s, as no machine was capable of running it. As ever, Turing's mind was outrunning the world's ability to put his ideas into actual practice. Nevertheless, the program is acknowledged as being the first realized concept for a modern computer game, and was the basis for later versions of computer AI in such games. In 1951, Turing turned to mathematical biology, a field aimed at the mathematical representation and modeling of biological processes, using the techniques and tools of applied mathematics. This was an area in which Turing had been working either directly or indirectly to some extent for 20 years, but his endeavors in cryptography and computing had taken precedence for various reasons at various different times. Now in Manchester, with his work on computing having slowed following the appearance of the Manchester Mark and the Ace, this period of his career entered something of a hiatus, and he focused more on mathematical biology. The result was one of his most significant outputs, submitted to the Royal Society in November 1951 and published in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society of London the following year. The paper, entitled The Chemical Basis of Morphogenesis, argued that patterns which appear in nature, such as stripes and spirals, can arise naturally through morphogenesis, the biological process whereby organisms of various kinds acquire their shape and structure. Turing argued that there was a chemical basis to this phenomenon. His argument quickly became one of the most important theories in theoretical biology. The arguments Turing outlined in this work were pioneering in developing our understanding of how phenomena such as spots and stripes on cats and other animals appear. Even today, his theories continue to underpin our conception of how feathers appear on certain animals and hair patterns on humans. Simultaneously, in recognition of much of this work and his wide-ranging output up to the early 1950s, Turing was elected to a position as a Fellow of the Royal Society, the most prestigious academy of sciences in the world, in 1951. And yet it was all to be cut markedly short. Turing's career was diversifying over the early 1950s, but it soon ran into a major personal crisis. In January 1952, Alan started a relationship in Manchester with one Arnold Murray, a 19-year-old man whom he had met in a chance encounter on Oxford Street near central Manchester. However, within weeks the budding relationship soured, and on the 23rd of January 1952, Turing's house was broken into and robbed. The criminal was an acquaintance of Murray's, a fact which Arnold admitted to Turing, who now reported the break-in to the police. The subsequent investigation set off a course of events which are generally deemed to have spiraled into Turing's death 2 years later. Whilst being questioned by police following the burglary, it became clear to the authorities that Turing and Murray were involved romantically with each other. Homosexual acts were prohibited in the United Kingdom in the early 1950s, according to a law which had been introduced during the late 19th century, and which was still in force. It was as a result of this law that Turing now found himself prosecuted following the burglary of his home. The case came to trial in March of 1952. Turing, who seems to have been open about his sexuality throughout his adult life, despite the potential repercussions, was reluctant to even argue against the accusations. Eventually, he submitted a guilty plea on advice from his legal counsel. Following his conviction, he was presented with a choice. He could accept a custodial sentence in which he would be incarcerated, or he could undergo an experimental treatment designed to reduce his libido. This involved the administration of a synthetic form of estrogen, one of the primary female sex hormones. Turing chose the experimental treatment. It was not without serious consequences. In the months ahead, he became impotent as a result of the treatment, and he began to form breast tissue as another side effect. Moreover, his conviction had seen him lose his security clearance, and he was henceforth denied entry to the United States. The exact extent to which this treatment impacted on Turing's mental state in the weeks and months that followed, and the degree to which this led to his death, is a matter of substantial contention. But it must have been a considerable factor. Even perhaps if Turing was unaware himself of the full extent to which he'd been affected by it. On the 8th of June of 1954, Turing was found dead by his housekeeper at home in his bedroom. He had died from cyanide poisoning. A half-eaten apple lay next to his bed. An investigation concluded that Turing had intentionally poisoned the apple with the cyanide and consumed it, his aim being to make his death appear to be an accident in order to protect his mother, Sarah, from thinking that he had taken his own life. If it was Turing's intention to convince his mother that his death was accidental, he was successful in this. Sarah Turing would maintain for the remainder of her life that Alan had accidentally ingested the cyanide, which he had been using at home in an experiment. Indeed, a number of scholars since have questioned whether this might have been the case. For instance, it has been noted that those who knew Turing personally between 1952 and 1954 recollect that he had not been too affected mentally by his conviction and the experimental treatment he had been forced to undertake, while others have suggested that Turing did not even ingest the cyanide which killed him, but might have inhaled it in the air into which it had dispersed during the experiment he was carrying out at his residence. In this interpretation, it has been noted that Turing had been making plans for the weeks ahead, right up until his death, and had even ordered laboratory equipment days prior to his demise. Why would he have done so, if it was his intention to commit suicide just days later? The truth is, we will never be 100% sure. Although suicide still seems the most likely explanation for Turing's death, whatever the circumstances, the fact remains that Britain lost one of its most substantial modern scientists, at a time when Turing had many years of perhaps his best research ahead of him to build on the substantial body of work he had already carried out in the previous 20 years. He was just 41. Turing was cremated at Woking Crematorium on the 12th of June 1954. For many years, his role in Britain's war effort was underappreciated, as indeed were some of his more substantial contributions to the fields of mathematical biology and related disciplines. It has been argued that this lack of appreciation was owing to the controversy which surrounded his conviction in 1952 and the manner of his death. But with changing societal attitudes towards homosexuality in Britain in the late 20th and early 21st century, his legacy is now appreciated for how substantial it was. In 2014, some 62 years after the event itself, he received a royal pardon for his conviction, only the fourth such pardon to have been bestowed by Queen Elizabeth II since 1945. Alan Turing was one of the most significant scientists of the 20th century and a prophet of the digital age in the public's imagination. Owing to recent films such as The Imitation Game of 2014 and other media, he is best remembered as the genius of Bletchley Park, who orchestrated the cracking of the Nazis' Enigma code and helped win the Second World War. As Hugh Alexander, the head of Hut 8 at Bletchley Park from 1943 to 1945, later stated, "There should be no question in anyone's mind that Turing's work was the biggest factor in Hut 8's success. In the early days, he was the only cryptographer who thought the problem worth tackling, and not only was he primarily responsible for the main theoretical work within the Hut, but he also shared with Welchman and Keene the chief credit for the invention of the bomb. It is always difficult to say that anyone is absolutely indispensable, but if anyone was indispensable to Hut 8, it was Turing." This, by any standard, would have been a significant legacy for any one individual, yet there were many other accomplishments. Late in his all-too-brief life, Turing conducted work which produced major developments in the fields of mathematical biology and morphogenesis. The Turing Test, which he originated in the aftermath of the war, is a standard method of testing artificial intelligence against human intelligence, and is utilized in a tangential fashion by anyone who uses a captcha test online to prove they are not a robot. He is even the theoretical co-inventor of the first video game, TurboChamp, which he developed with David Gowan Champernowne in the late 1940s. But in reality, the most significant legacy of this spectacular polymath must surely lie in the conception and development of the Universal Turing Machine, an electronic device which would be capable of carrying out a multiplicity of tasks all located within the confines of one machine or device. In its simplicity, this machine was the forerunner of the modern personal computer. Turing, more than anyone, was the main advocate for and conceiver of such a device in the 1930s and 1940s. In recognition of that fact, in 1999, Time magazine included him in its list of the 100 most significant individuals of the 20th century, noting that anyone who works on a modern computer is working in one way or another on a version of the Universal Turing Machine. Moreover, the Turing Award, the highest distinction in the field of computer science, awarded by the Association for Computing Machinery, has been named after him, in recognition of his seminal work in the field. This is the primary legacy of one of the most underappreciated scientists of the modern age. What do you think of Alan Turing? Was he one of the most significant scientists of the 20th century? And what might he have achieved if he had lived a longer, fuller life? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. We would like to thank our sponsor, Brilliant, the problem-solving website and app for people like you who are curious and love solving problems. Brilliant offers a choice of courses to develop your knowledge, including classes on scientific thinking, quantitative science, and maths to enhance your knowledge and make you think, using interactive learning techniques and active problem solving to provide inspiring learning that makes problem solving fun. If you're interested in computer modeling, we would recommend the Introduction to Neural Networks course. This fascinating course will start you on a journey to become the next Alan Turing. Go to www.brilliant.org/thepeopleprofiles to sign up for free. And also, the first 200 people will get 20% off their annual premium membership. Hello guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoy our work and would like to support the channel, please visit our revamped Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee membership pages, which contain rewards, such as early access to our content, merchandise discounts, and audio versions of our videos, along with much more that we give to our valued supporters. If you have not yet signed up to help our cause, we'd like to ask you to please consider doing so, as we need to secure the channel by safeguarding it from possible demonetization, and also invest in better equipment, software, and more people to help us improve our videos going forward. In short, without your contributions, these videos would not be possible. So if you would like to ensure this channel never has to shut down due to demonetization, please spare whatever you can per month and become People Profiles patrons. Thanks for listening.